Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're about to jump into a really fascinating exploration looking at the world of ancient Palestine.
Yeah, we're using a collection of lecture guides from Professor Jody Magnes as our main source here.
Exactly, and it lets us kind of weave together insights from both archaeology and historical texts.
It really is quite a journey through time we're talking about, isn't it? I mean, we're looking at roughly 5,000
5
years.
millennia,
Yeah.
from the earliest Canaanite settlements.
Right up to the arrival of Islamic rule in the 7th century AD. It's just a fantastic chance to get a really solid grasp of a truly pivotal region.
Absolutely, and what's great, I think, is the sheer variety of evidence we get to look at. We'll be considering accounts from the Hebrew Bible, for instance, and comparing them with, the physical stuff dug up by archaeologists.
And also bringing in perspectives from writers like Josephus and Philo of Alexandria.
Yeah. So the goal here is really to get to the heart of what's important, to pull out those key insights, maybe even some surprising facts.
That give you, the listener, a real shortcut to being well-informed about this ancient land.
Okay, let's start unpacking this then. First off, this area has gone by many names over the centuries, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Holy Land, Palestine, Land of Israel, or Eretz Israel, and going way back, Canaan.
And we'll be focusing on two main periods. The First Temple period, that's roughly 960 to 586 BC, ending with the Babylonian destruction.
Right.
And then the Second Temple period, running from about 516 BC right up to 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed the temple.
And I think it's really crucial right from the start to understand the difference, but also the connection between history and archaeology.
Okay.
History, in this context anyway, is mostly about studying the written documents, the texts you mentioned.
Got it.
Archaeology, though, that's about looking at the physical stuff, the material culture left behind. They give you different kinds of information, you see.
Right. Complementary but distinct.
Exactly. And looking at them together gives us a much richer picture, though sometimes, a more complex one. Yeah, especially when the written sources are maybe limited or, have a particular angle.
Right. So before the Israelites arrived on the scene, the land was inhabited by the Canaanites. They settled there about, 5,000 years ago?
Around then, yes. And they weren't like a single empire. Think more. Independent city-states.
Fortified cities.
Precisely. Often built on the ruins of even older settlements. This creates these artificial mounds that archaeologists call tells.
Ah, the tells. Like layers of history stacked up.
Kind of like a layer cake of civilizations, exactly. Each group builds on what was there before. And Jerusalem, that was one of these Canaanite cities. We found Bronze Age stuff there, even letters exchanged with Egyptian pharaohs.
Which brings us to the Hebrew Bible. It's obviously fundamental for understanding this period, but as Professor Magnes points out, it wasn't written all at once. It was compiled, edited over centuries. So how do we approach it as a historical source?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We have to be mindful of the sometimes significant time gaps between the events it describes and when those descriptions were actually written down.
Okay.
There's oral transmission, the writing process itself, editing over generations. It all means we need to engage with it carefully. Compare its stories with the physical evidence from archaeology and other contemporary writings whenever we can.
Now, the Bible tells the story of the Israelite tribes settling in Canaan during the Late Bronze Age. That's 14th, 13th centuries BC.
Roughly, yes. And that's also the traditional time frame given for the Exodus from Egypt.
So what does archaeology tell us about that specific transition period?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting and frankly challenging. The Exodus, as it's often pictured, a huge group of people moving through the desert, living nomadically.
Right.
That kind of event wouldn't necessarily leave behind a lot of obvious archaeological evidence. They weren't building permanent cities or making tons of durable pottery during the journey itself.
That makes sense. No giant monuments being carted through the Sinai. But Professor Magnes does mention the Merneptah stele. What's that, and why is it important here?
Ah, yes. The Merneptah stele. It's a big stone slab, basically a victory monument, set up by the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah late in the 13th century BC.
Okay.
He lists his military wins, and crucially for us, it contains the earliest known reference to Israel outside of the Bible.
Wow. So it mentions Israel.
It does. Now, it doesn't describe the Exodus event itself, but its existence shows that a group known as Israel was definitely present in the region of Canaan around the time the Exodus is traditionally dated.
So it's like a historical anchor point suggesting they were there.
Exactly.
But it doesn't confirm the whole Exodus story is told in the Bible.
Not definitively, no. And that's precisely why the actual scale and the nature of the Exodus are still debated among scholars. Was it a massive event, a smaller migration? Did Israelite identity emerge more gradually within Canaan itself? These are ongoing discussions.
Okay, let's focus on Jerusalem. It's such a central place in this whole story. Professor Magnes talks about its early layout, starting in the city of David.
Right, down on the eastern hill, crucially, right next to the Gihon Spring.
The only reliable water source nearby.
The only perennial one, yes. And that location was naturally defensible too, with valleys on two sides offering protection.
And then it grew.
It did. Under Solomon, it expanded north to include the Temple Mount, which became, the religious and political center. And later, it spread west onto the western hill, again using the landscape for defense.
Why did David pick Jerusalem as his capital, though? It wasn't a major Israelite center before him, was it?
No, and that's probably key. It seems like a very strategic choice. Geographically, it was pretty central.
Right.
But maybe more importantly, it was politically neutral. It hadn't belonged to any of the 12 Israelite tribes. So choosing it likely helped David unify the kingdom without showing favoritism.
Clever. So David brings the Ark of the Covenant there, making it religiously significant. And then Solomon builds the first temple on the Temple Mount. But after Solomon dies, around 930 BC, the kingdom splits.
Precisely. You get the northern kingdom of Israel, with its capital eventually at Samaria, and the southern kingdom of Judah, keeping Jerusalem as its capital. And they go their separate ways, politically speaking, for centuries.
Now, you mentioned earlier we haven't found archaeological remains of the first temple itself. That always surprises people.
It does, but that doesn't mean we haven't found anything from that era in Jerusalem.
Okay, so what have we found in the city of David from David and Solomon's time?
Well, excavations there have definitely uncovered remains from that period on top of earlier Canaanite layers. There's a really massive stepstone structure, sort of a sloping embankment.
Glacis?
Exactly, a glacis, probably built to support a large building higher up. And above that, remains of a monumental building that actually predates Solomon's big expansion northward have been found, likely part of the original fortified city.
And isn't there evidence outside the Bible that even mentions the House of David?
Yes, the Tel Dan stele. It dates to the 9th century BC, and it has an inscription in Aramaic that includes that exact phrase, House of David. It's really important external confirmation for the Davidic dynasty mentioned in the Bible.
Fascinating. Okay, back to basics.
Yeah.
Water. Living in a city, especially one prone to sieges, water is life. The Gihon Spring was the only source. How did they manage?
It was a constant issue. The spring was actually outside the main city walls, down at the bottom of the hill,
Right.
vulnerable.
Right.
So over time, they got clever, developing more and more sophisticated water systems to bring water inside the protected area.
And Professor Magnes highlights Hezekiah's tunnel. That sounds like a major engineering project.
Oh, it was absolutely remarkable for its time. Cut in the late 8th century BC, it's this winding tunnel, maybe 500 meters long, carved straight through solid rock under the city of David.
Wow.
And the amazing part is the gradient, it slopes down so gently, just about 0.6%.
Yeah.
Plus, it seems it was dug by two teams starting from opposite ends.
And they met in the middle.
They somehow met in the middle, through solid rock. That kind of precision back then, it just hints at incredible planning and skill.
Right, so after the kingdom split, we've got Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Professor Magnes mentions that their religious practices started to differ a bit, especially around the worship of Yahweh.
Yes, there's archaeological evidence, particularly from sites in the north like Tel Dan, that suggests maybe a different kind of religious expression compared to Judah. While Judah focused worship in Jerusalem, the north seems to have perhaps blended Yahweh worship with elements from older Canaanite traditions. The altar found at Tel Dan, for instance, is often pointed to as evidence of this.
And we also have that Mesha stele you mentioned before, shedding light on the north.
Exactly. That inscription by the Moabite king Mesha around 840 BC actually confirms parts of the biblical story about Moab rebelling against Israel's Amorite dynasty. It gives us a non-biblical perspective on those events.
It's always compelling when different sources line up like that. Professor Magnes also points to links between King Ahab of Israel and the Phoenicians, backed by archaeology. What kind of evidence is there?
Well, archaeologically, you see signs of Phoenician-influenced building styles, artifacts in the northern kingdom during Ahab's time.
Okay.
And that fits well with the Bible's description of close political ties, trade, even royal marriage, and shared religious influences, like the worship of Baal.
Switching to defense, you mentioned a specific type of Israelite gateway. What was special about them?
These gateways, found at several Israelite sites, were clearly built for serious defense. Typically, you had a central passage, but on each side there were 3 chambers, like rooms, built into the gate structure, plus projecting towers.
So like an obstacle course for attackers.
Pretty much. It created multiple choke points and allowed defenders inside the chambers to attack anyone trying to get through. Made storming the gate much, much harder.
But even those strong gates couldn't save the northern kingdom forever. Samaria falls to the Assyrians, 722 BC, population exiled.
Right, that's basically the end of the northern kingdom as a distinct entity.
But Judah, in the south, they hold out longer against the Assyrians.
Yes, Judah, under King Hezekiah, manages to survive the Assyrian invasion a bit later, but Israel, the northern kingdom, essentially vanishes from the historical map after 722.
Okay, let's jump forward a few centuries. Alexander the Great arrives, and with him comes Hellenization, this spread of Greek culture. How did that change things in Palestine, especially for the non-Jewish folks?
Hellenization had a huge impact, though it varied. For non-Jewish groups, you see cities like Ammon getting renamed Philadelphia, gaining some independence.
Okay.
And the Tobiads, a prominent Jewish family governing that area, they even set up a new center at Tyros today called Iraq El Amir. Archaeology there has found this impressive building, maybe a palace or temple.
With Greek influence?
Definitely. Animal carvings, fancy fountains, living quarters cut into the rock nearby. It all dates to the early 2nd century BC and clearly shows Hellenistic, artistic, and architectural styles being adopted.
So they're picking up Greek styles, but maybe keeping their local identity too.
Exactly. You see a similar mix on the Phoenician coast. At Tel Dor, for example, they've found an imported marble statue of the Greek god Hermes.
Wow.
And the town was laid out on a grid plan, very Greek. But interestingly, their actual house construction still used traditional Phoenician methods, so it's this fascinating blend.
This mixing of cultures eventually creates friction, right? Especially when the Seleucid rulers tried to force Hellenistic practices onto the Jewish population. Which leads us to the Maccabean revolt.
Yes, things really came to a head under Antiochus V Epiphanes around 167 BC. He did some pretty extreme things, rededicated the Jerusalem temple to Zeus, brought in pagan rituals, even sacred prostitution. Yeah. And that lit the fuse for the rebellion, led by the Hasmonean family, starting with Mattathias, then his sons, especially Judah Maccabee.
And they actually succeeded in pushing back, didn't they? Winning back religious freedom?
Initially, yes. After some military wins and Antiochus V's death, the really offensive decrees were withdrawn. The temple was cleansed and rededicated, that's the event behind Hanukkah, in 164 BC.
Right.
But the fight wasn't over. The Maccabees kept pushing for full political independence from the Seleucids, which they finally got under Simon in 142 BC.
And the Hasmonean kingdom then started expanding its own territory under leaders like John Hyrcanus III.
That's right. John Hyrcanus pushed the borders out significantly. He conquered places like Idumea.
Where Herod the Great's family came from.
His grandfather, yes.
Yeah.
And Hyrcanus forcibly converted the Idumeans to Judaism. He also destroyed the Samaritan temple up on Mount Gerizim, which was a major event in Jewish-Samaritan relations.
You mentioned the Nabateans earlier. How do they fit in during this period?
The Nabateans were neighbors to the south, an Arab people who got incredibly wealthy running caravan routes through the desert.
Trading luxury goods.
Things like frankincense and myrrh, yeah. Very profitable. And you can still see their wealth today in the ruins of their capital, Petra.
Oh, Petra. With the amazing rock-cut buildings.
Exactly. The colonnaded streets, temples, the theater carved into the rock, those incredible tombs, all showing strong Hellenistic influence, too. They were a major regional player the Hasmoneans definitely interacted with.
So the Hasmonean period brings independence, but it also sees the rise of different Jewish factions or sects, right? Professor Magnes talks about the Pharisees and Sadducees. What were the main differences?
Yeah, the emergence of these groups, Pharisees, Sadducees, and also the Essenes, it shows a time of intense internal debate about Jewish law and tradition. The Sadducees, they likely came from the old priestly families, the Zadokites, who had lost some control earlier. They became associated with the Jerusalem elite, the temple hierarchy, and tended to be more conservative, politically and religiously.
Okay, so more establishment. And the Pharisees.
The Pharisees had a broader base of support, lower-ranking priests, artisans, farmers. A really key difference was their belief in oral tradition alongside the written Torah. Exactly. They believed that learned teachers, rabbis, could interpret the law for new situations, and that these interpretations, passed down orally, were also authoritative. This emphasis on oral tradition becomes hugely important for later rabbinic Judaism.
This seems like a good place to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Qumran community. An incredible discovery, giving us a window into Jewish life back then. What was the site of Qumran like?
Qumran itself, down near the Dead Sea, was set up around 100 BC, maybe a bit earlier, and lasted until the Romans destroyed it in 68 AD. Excavations show it wasn't a typical town with family homes.
No private houses.
Seems not. The buildings look communal workshops, a large dining hall, maybe a scriptorium where scrolls were copied, and a really complex water system for ritual purity. Based on the size and the nearby cemetery, maybe 100, 150 people live there.
And the scrolls themselves, over 900 found in nearby caves.
It's just astounding, like finding a hidden library. Many are fragments, of course, but they cover a huge range of religious texts. About a quarter are copies of books from the Hebrew Bible.
The oldest copies we have.
By far. And they show variations from the later standard text. There were also bits of the Septuagint, the Greek translation, and many other Jewish writings, some previously unknown.
Professor Magnes notes some odd things about Qumran, like deposits of animal bones in the cemetery. What might those tell us?
Well, the animal bones are interesting. They're all from kosher animals, buried in specific ways. The main theory is that this community, likely led by dissident Zadokite priests who thought the Jerusalem temple was corrupt, practiced these communal meals perhaps as a substitute for temple sacrifices. The way the bones were buried seems ritualistic. And the cemetery, it's overwhelmingly adult males. Very few women, no children found so far.
Suggesting a monastic-like community.
Strongly suggests a largely male community, yeah. Not a standard settlement with families.
This Qumran community is usually linked with the Essenes, one of those sects we mentioned. What do the scrolls and the archaeology suggest about their beliefs and lifestyle?
If we put it all together, the Essenes, as described by ancient writers like Josephus and hinted at in their own scrolls, seem to have been quite exclusive, sort of separate from mainstream society.
Different from Jesus's more inclusive approach later.
Very different, yeah. They had this strong apocalyptic worldview, seeing history as a battle between the sons of light themselves and the sons of darkness. They believed in predestination and, interestingly, in two messiahs to come, a royal one and a priestly one.
Reflecting their own priestly origins.
Likely, yes. And the scrolls mention these figures, the teacher of righteousness and the wicked priest.
Who were they thought to be?
Well, the scrolls don't name names, which is frustrating. But the teacher of righteousness is generally seen as the community's founder or revered early leader. The wicked priest is thought to be his opponent, maybe one of the Hasmonean high priests in Jerusalem who they saw as illegitimate.
Professor Magnes even mentions research into their toilet facilities. Archaeology gets specific.
It really does. But it's revealing. They found a room at Qumran identified as a latrine with a pit. What's interesting is its location and the fact it connects to a ritual bath area.
Okay.
And some of the scrolls, like the War Scroll and Temple Scroll, have very specific rules about where latrines should be placed relative to the camp or city outside, certain distance away, enclosed. The find at Qumran seems to match these rules quite well.
Suggesting a deep concern for ritual purity.
Exactly. Even in the most mundane aspects of life, the connection to the ritual bath really emphasizes that.
Okay, so the Hasmonean kingdom, after all that struggle for independence, eventually falls under Roman control in 63 BC. How did that happen?
It basically happened because of internal Hasmonean squabbling. A civil war broke out between two brothers, sons of Salome Alexandra, and both appealed to Rome, specifically Pompey the Great, for help.
Big mistake.
Huge mistake. Pompey saw his chance, intervened, took Jerusalem, and effectively ended Hasmonean independence. Rome reorganized things, putting Hyrcanus II in charge as ethnarch, but giving real power to Antipater and Idumean.
Antipater, father of Herod the Great.
The very same. Antipater's influence grew, paving the way for his son. Herod's rise is quite the story itself.
Yeah, sounds like you played the political game very effectively.
Oh, incredibly so. He navigated the chaos of the late Roman Republic, getting support initially from the Nabateans, even Cleopatra for a time. Eventually, Mark Antony and the Roman Senate declared him king of Judea in 40 BC.
But he had to fight for it.
He did. Took him 3 years to actually defeat the last Hasmonean claimant, Mattathias Antigonus, who was backed by the Parthians. The Romans besieged Jerusalem for him in 37 BC.
So Herod becomes king, backed by Rome. But he wasn't exactly popular, was he?
Not with many of his Jewish subjects, no. And his reign was marked by ruthlessness. After Antony and Cleopatra lost to Octavian later, Augustus Herod quickly switched sides and actually got his kingdom expanded. But he was deeply paranoid, especially about rivals within his own family.
Leading to executions.
Many executions, including his wife Mariamne, whom he supposedly loved, and several of his sons. This reputation for cruelty might be the historical kernel behind the story of the massacre of the innocents in Matthew's Gospel.
And that famous quote from Augustus.
Ah, yes. It is better to be Herod's pig than his son. A grim pun, since Herod, observing Jewish law, wouldn't eat pork, but he had no problem killing his sons. It sums up his tyranny pretty well.
Despite that dark side, Herod's known as this massive builder. Let's talk about his projects, starting in Jerusalem. The Temple Mount transformation sounds huge.
He was arguably the greatest builder in Palestine's history. In Jerusalem, the Temple Mount was his crown jewel. He massively expanded the platform it stood on, creating this huge, flat, artificial area.
Much bigger than before.
Oh, much bigger. And surrounded it with these grand porticos, or covered walkways for pilgrims. He also built a fortress with 3 large towers named for his brother, friend, and wife, protecting the palace and the western approach to the city.
And that royal stoa, or basilica on the south side, what was that for?
That was an enormous 2-story hall running along the whole southern edge. It wasn't just for religious purposes. It was a major public space, commerce, law courts, meetings, kind of like the civic center of the temple complex.
And the western wall, the Wailing Wall that's part of Herod's construction.
That's right. It's a surviving section of the massive retaining wall Herod built to support the expanded Temple Mount platform. He also built various gates into the enclosure. You can still see remnants like Robinson's Arch, which once supported a huge staircase leading down to the street level where pilgrims shopped.
How did people get up onto the mount itself?
The main entrances for the public were the Hulda gates on the southern wall. They led into tunnels that went underneath the royal stoa and then up via staircases onto the platform itself.
Were there restricted areas within the complex?
Yes. Around the inner temple building itself, there was a low barrier called the Soreg. Inscriptions in Greek and Latin were found, warning non-Jews not to go any further on penalty of death.
So Gentiles could enter the outer courts, but not the sacred inner areas.
Exactly. Clear boundaries were maintained.
Herod didn't just build in Jerusalem, though. Caesarea Maritima, that was a major project, too.
Huge project. He took a small existing town on the coast and turned it into this magnificent port city, all laid out in the Roman style, and named it, of course, in honor of Caesar Augustus.
And the harbor itself was innovative.
Revolutionary, really, using underwater concrete. Archaeologically, Caesarea is rich. They found that famous stone mentioning Pontius Pilate there.
Right.
Plus a theater, Herod's palace on a promontory overlooking the sea, likely the praetorium where Paul was held, according to the book of Acts.
And he also rebuilt Samaria, but maybe with a different audience in mind.
Yes, Samaria, the old northern capital. He rebuilt it monumentally and renamed it Sebastus, that's Greek for Augustus. He gave it all the Roman features. Colonnaded street, a big temple to Augustus in Roma, theater, stadium, forum.
So Jerusalem projects were maybe aimed at pleasing Jewish subjects.
Well, Caesarea and Sebastus were more about impressing Rome and catering to the Hellenese, non-Jewish populations in his kingdom, a balancing act.
So Herod dies. His kingdom gets divided. What happened next?
It got split between 3 of his surviving sons. Archelaus got the core territory, Judea, Samaria, Idumea. Antipas got Galilee and Perea across the Jordan. And Philip got the territories up north and east, the Golan region.
How do they fare?
Archelaus was a disaster, so bad that the Jews and Samaritans actually petitioned Rome to remove him, which Augustus did in 6 AD. His territory then came under direct Roman rule, administered by prefects like Pontius Pilate, based in Caesarea. Philip ruled relatively quietly until his death.
And Herod Antipas, he ruled for quite a while.
He did, the longest of the 3. He's the Herod in the Gospels during Jesus' ministry.
Yeah.
And yes, he's the one who executed John the Baptist, supposedly because John criticized his marriage to Herodias, his brother's former wife. Antipas was eventually exiled by Emperor Caligula.
Which brings us back to Pontius Pilate, ruling Judea directly for Rome.
Right, from 26 to 36 AD. History doesn't paint a kind picture, known for being corrupt, provoking the Jews, using excessive force. His handling of Jesus' trial, as described in the Gospels, kind of fits that pattern. He, too, was eventually recalled to Rome. And Herod himself, he was buried in that massive fortress palace he built, Herodium, near Bethlehem.
Okay, so that sets the scene for the world Jesus lived in. Professor Magnes zooms in on Galilee, the towns and villages, What do we know archaeologically about places like Bethlehem or Nazareth from that time?
Well, Bethlehem actually has surprisingly few remains from the 1st century AD. Nazareth was, until relatively recently, thought to be tiny or non-existent then, but archaeology has now uncovered a small house dating right to Jesus' time.
Really? What was it like?
Very simple, small, courtyard-style house, very typical of Galilean villages of the period. It gives us a real glimpse into the kind of modest environment he likely grew up in. Nearby Sepphoris, though, was a major Romanized city just a few miles away.
Did Jesus likely go there?
It's debated. It had a theater, lots going on, but the Gospels don't mention him visiting, so maybe not. Other Galilean villages we do hear about, like Capernaum, Chorazin, Gamla. Archaeology shows they were mostly based on fishing, farming, some trade. Capernaum had a customs post under Herod Antipas.
And Gamla showed some differences in wealth.
Yeah, some nicer houses there. And interestingly, an olive press found near a ritual bath, a mitha, suggests they were concerned about ritual purity and oil production, maybe for temple tithes or something similar.
Jesus is often described teaching in synagogues. What were they like back then? Were they primarily buildings for prayer?
That's a key point. Initially, synagogue meant the assembly, the group of people, more than the building. Early synagogue buildings that we found, like at Masada, Gamla, Magdala, they're often quite simple architecturally.
Not like later synagogues.
Not really. They weren't always oriented towards Jerusalem, didn't have a fixed niche for the Torah scrolls yet, and often had few specifically Jewish symbols at first. An inscription from Jerusalem, the Theodotus inscription, describes a synagogue built before 70 AD for reading the Torah and teaching no mention of prayer as the main function, or of a rabbi leading it.
And the Magdala synagogue had that unique stone.
Yes, a carved stone table or block decorated with menorahs and other temple-related imagery. Very unusual. And Paul, of course, famously taught in synagogues around the Roman world, controversially welcoming Gentiles without requiring full conversion.
Thinking about Jesus' last days in Jerusalem, are there archaeological sites linked to those events?
Well, tradition connects the Antonia Fortress, Herod's garrison northwest of the Temple Mount, with Pilate sentencing Jesus and the start of the Via Dolorosa. Archaeologically, it's plausible, but not definitively proven as the spot. We have excavated wealthy homes on the Western Hill in today's Jewish quarter. These show how the Jerusalem elite lived Roman-style villas, frescoes, imported goods. That's likely the kind of setting for the Last Supper, perhaps.
And there's debate about a third wall.
Yeah, whether an outer wall protecting the northern suburbs existed already in Jesus' time or was built later, it affects where you might place the site of the crucifixion, which the Gospels say was outside the city walls then.
Let's talk about death and burial. Understanding Jewish practices gives context to Jesus' burial. What were early Jerusalem tombs like?
Back in the First Temple period, wealthy families used rock-cut tombs outside the city. Usually a doorway led to a chamber with benches cut into the sides.
Where the bodies were laid?
Initially, yes. Then, when space was needed for new burials, the bones of earlier individuals were gathered up and put into a pit or repository, often under the benches, sometimes with grave goods.
Did that practice continue unbroken?
No, the Babylonian exile interrupted it. Rock-cut tombs didn't really reappear in Jerusalem until the Hasmonean period, when a new elite emerged. And they started building more monumental tombs influenced by Hellenistic styles, like the famous mausoleum at Halicarnassus.
So Greek styles influenced Jewish tombs.
To some extent, yeah. The Hasmonean family tomb at Modin was described as having columns and pyramids, very grand. The Jerusalem elite then followed suit, creating rock-cut tombs but with much more elaborate entrances, sometimes with inscriptions or architectural facades.
And then in the Herodian period, the time of Jesus, we see another development, ossuaries.
Exactly. Rock-cut family tombs became very common among the Jerusalem wealthy. Hundreds have been found. But starting around the middle of Herod's reign, maybe a bit before, this practice of using ossuaries, small stone boxes, became widespread, specifically in Jerusalem, lasting until 70 AD.
Why ossuaries? Why collect the bones in boxes?
The main explanation connects it to the growing Pharisaic belief in a physical resurrection of the dead. Collecting the bones neatly in a box might have been seen as preparing for that. Roman influence, like using urns for cremation ashes, could also be a factor. We've even found ossuaries believed to belong to Caiaphas, the high priest from the Gospels.
So how does this fit with the gospel story of Jesus' burial?
The description of Joseph of Arimathea placing Jesus' body in his own new rock-cut tomb sealed with a large rolling stone that fits perfectly with the burial customs of wealthy Jews in Jerusalem at that time.
Rolling stones were typical for those kinds of tombs.
Yes, for the more elaborate tombs. The tomb of Queen Helena of Adiabene, another prominent figure buried in Jerusalem, also had one. But it's crucial to remember this was for the elite. Most people would have been buried much more simply.
Exactly. In plain trench graves in the ground, much less visible archaeologically.
What about more recent claims, like the Talpiot tomb being Jesus' family tomb or the James ossuary? Professor Magnes, like many archaeologists, views these claims with skepticism. They often rely on statistical arguments about names found together, but overlook the fact that these names were incredibly common.
Right.
And fundamentally, people like Jesus and his family likely wouldn't have had an expensive rock-cut tomb with ossuaries in Jerusalem. That was a practice of the wealthy Jerusalem elite. The claims often don't align with the basic archaeological and social realities of the time.
The peace under Rome didn't last. The first Jewish revolt breaks out in 66 AD. What led to it and what was the outcome?
It was a buildup of things. Instability after Herod, resentment towards Roman governors who were often corrupt or insensitive, messianic expectations, internal Jewish factionalism. It all exploded in 66 AD.
And the Romans responded forcefully.
Very forcefully. Vespasian and later his son Titus led the campaign. It culminated in the brutal siege and destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple in 70 AD. The Antonia fortress fell first, ending temple sacrifices. Then the Temple Mount itself was overrun and burned. The upper city on the western hill held out last.
And we have archaeological evidence of that destruction.
Vivid evidence. The burnt house excavated in the Jewish quarter is a prime example. A wealthy home destroyed in the fire, with artifacts, coins, even human skeletal remains found inside, telling a grim story.
But the fall of Jerusalem wasn't the absolute end of the revolt. Masada holds out.
Right. Resistance continued in isolated pockets. Herodium, Machaerus, and most famously, Masada. Herod's seemingly impregnable fortress on a mountaintop near the Dead Sea.
A dramatic siege.
Absolutely. Thousands of Roman troops camped around it, built observation towers, a siege wall, and eventually this enormous earthen ramp up the western slope to breach the walls. Took them months, maybe in 73 or 74 AD.
And the story of mass suicide.
That comes entirely from the historian Josephus. He says the 967 rebels inside chose suicide over capture, archaeologically. Well, we haven't found evidence to definitively prove or disprove it. A few skeletons were found, but not hundreds. What we do have are the incredibly well-preserved Roman siege works all around Masada. The camps, the ram, tangible evidence of the immense effort involved.
Even after that devastating war, hopes for rebuilding the temple didn't die out completely, did they? But then Emperor Hadrian comes along.
Right. Jewish hopes remained. But Hadrian's decision, around 129 AD, to rebuild Jerusalem not as a Jewish city, but as a Roman pagan colony named Aelia Capitolina.
Aelia Capitolina.
Yes. And worse, he planned a temple to Jupiter Capitolinus right on the Temple Mount itself. That was the final straw, sparking the Second Jewish Revolt, led by Simon Bar Kokhba from 132 to 135 AD.
Bar Kokhba, seen as a messiah by some.
By many, yes. It was another incredibly fierce revolt. But ultimately, the Romans crushed it, ending with the fall of the fortress of Bethar and Bar Kokhba's death. Discoveries in caves in the Judean desert, like Nahal Heber, have given us letters and artifacts from refugees fleeing that war.
And Hadrian went ahead with Aelia Capitolina. How did that change Jerusalem?
Completely reshaped it. He laid it out like a typical Roman city, roughly square, main north-south street, Cardo, main east-west street, Decumanus, forums, temples. The basic layout of Jerusalem's old city today still reflects Hadrian's Roman plan.
And the Temple Mount became the site for a pagan temple.
A temple to Jupiter, yes.
Yeah.
And where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre now stands, Hadrian built a forum with a basilica and a temple to Venus or Aphrodite. There's still debate about exactly how far south Aelia Capitolina extended.
Moving forward again, Christianity becomes legal, then dominant in the Byzantine period. How does that transform the Holy Land?
It's another massive shift. After Constantine legalizes Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313, and especially after he establishes Constantinople, the Holy Land becomes a major pilgrimage destination.
So lots of building.
Huge amount. The churches spring up everywhere on sites associated with Jesus and the Bible, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, built over Hadrian's temple complex, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, plus monasteries, hostels for pilgrims. Jerusalem itself expanded, its walls enclosing a larger area than the Old City today. The Temple Mount, though, was deliberately left desolate.
What about the Jewish communities during this Christian Byzantine era?
They persisted, though often facing restrictions. With the temple gone, synagogues became even more central to Jewish life. And synagogue architecture developed, buildings got larger, more elaborate, often clearly oriented towards Jerusalem.
With more decoration.
Yes, beautiful mosaic floors become common. Think of Beth Alpha or Hamath Tiberias. They often feature Jewish symbols like the menorah. Interestingly, some mosaics, like at Hamath Tiberias, also include Greco-Roman elements like the sun god Helios in his chariot and the signs of the zodiac.
Why include pagan imagery?
That's debated. Maybe it symbolized God's control over time and the cosmos, or maybe it was just decorative fashion. It shows a complex cultural interaction still happening.
And then in the 7th century, another major change, the arrival of Islam.
Yes, the Islamic conquests bring another profound transformation. Jerusalem becomes hugely important to Muslims too. The Temple Mount is revered as Al-Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary.
And the Dome of the Rock is built.
Exactly. One of the earliest and most stunning Islamic monuments, built over the sacred rock, believed to be linked to Abraham and Muhammad's night journey. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque is built nearby for congregational prayer. Interestingly, the Dome of the Rock's octagonal design might even echo the rotunda of the nearby Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And Muslim rule would then shape the region for the next 13 centuries until World War I.
Finally, Professor Magnes talks about archaeology itself, how it works, what it tells us. It's clearly more than just digging for treasure.
Oh, absolutely. It's a painstaking scientific process. She credits Sir William Flinders Petrie as really pioneering scientific excavation in Palestine, focusing on stratigraphy, understanding the layers of settlement, and using changes in pottery styles to create chronologies.
How do digs actually work?
Modern digs are meticulous. You usually excavate in specific squares within a grid, leaving sections unexcavated called balks between squares so you can see the layers, the stratigraphy. Everything is recorded obsessively. Notes, photos, drawings.
And then all the stuff you find.
It all gets processed, washed, sorted, analyzed, sometimes restored. The ultimate goal isn't just finding things, but publishing detailed scientific reports so others can understand exactly what was found, where it was found, and how the interpretations were reached. It allows the whole process to be reconstructed and evaluated.
In the future. More tech.
Definitely. Things like ground-penetrating radar, LIDAR, 3D virtual reconstructions, DNA analysis from human remains. They're all adding incredible new layers to what we can learn.
Well, this deep dive has certainly covered a huge amount of ground. It gives us, and hopefully you listening, not just knowledge, but also some really critical tools for thinking about this incredibly complex and important region and how we evaluate historical claims about it.
Yeah, I hope it sparks some curiosity, maybe a desire to keep up with the ongoing discoveries that are constantly happening over there.
Absolutely. So perhaps the thought to leave you with is this. Just consider how this constant interplay, this dialogue between the physical evidence from archaeology and the ancient texts, keeps reshaping how we understand the past.
Mm-hmm. Every new find, every rereading of a text invites us to look again, to perhaps see these ancient cultures and pivotal events in the Holy Land in a slightly different, maybe more nuanced light. It's a story that's definitely still unfolding.